Good evening. Our final instalment for the Nature Conservation Council of New South Wales Save Our Biodiversity Telethon is a very special interview I did a couple of days ago with Bob Carr, who you would of course remember as a former Premier of New South Wales, former Foreign Minister and very enthusiastic supporter of the environment. In Bob's time as Premier, a big expansion of the National Parks estate, of course he's a very enthusiastic bushwalker. But I caught up with him to have a chat about politics. We've got a state election coming up in just 9 months' time. And of course, here at the Nature Conservation Council, we want to make sure that climate and biodiversity are big issues when that election battle is taking place, and make sure that as far as possible, we keep the kinds of concerns that we've got about protecting our native species by protecting our native forests, looking after the water in the Murray-Darling Basin, all of those issues that we work so hard on. March next year is a big opportunity to make sure that our voices are heard on those, and that candidates who get elected are the ones that frankly share our values and share our concerns. So important conversation I had with Bob. I really enjoyed it. I hope you enjoy it too.
Bob Carr, thank you so much for joining us at the NCC End of Financial Year Telethon. Really appreciate it. Bob, in addition to being the longest serving Premier of New South Wales, one of New South Wales's most effective environment ministers, you are yourself a nature lover. Where do you think we're at in New South Wales right now? We've had a Liberal government in since 2011. Matt Kean, of course, made environment a big portfolio priority in the last couple of years. How do you think they're tracking? What do you think the big issues are going into March 2023?
I think the big issue is land clearing. I fought very hard to rein in inappropriate land clearing, and we had a lot of success. We ended up having a very good dialogue with farmers about it after some initial hardline resistance that they directed at us in our first term, 1995 to 1999. But I think with coalition governments, if I can talk candidly about politics, you always get the pressure of the National Party looking after its base, very often irrigators or farmers in the arid zone or semi-arid zone who've got a commitment to broadacre land clearing without careful regard for the consequences. A lot of farmers, let me very quickly say, the best land managers you could possibly have with their knowledge of soils and vegetation and climatic shift. Very large numbers, very large proportion of farmers in New South Wales making a commitment to action on climate. But I think land clearing is the big challenge for any coalition government, and certainly this one.
What do you think drives that? As you say, farmers oftentimes are some of the best conservationists. Certainly the Farmers Federation are keen to point that out to me whenever I talk to them. And we've got farmers within our own network here at NCC. People who've lived for generations in the bush. What do you think the key driver is for that land? Is it corporations? Is it sort of family farmers? What do you think is driving the sort of deforestation land clearing agenda?
I'm not sure. You'd need to talk to your sources and your contacts about that question. And of course, I've been out of touch, out of politics now for 15, 16 years. But the economic predicament of farmers who might be on what could be described as marginal land can be a very real one. And that could drive a lot of it. But certainly corporate instinct in other circumstances is something that ought to be tested. But I think it's time to take good stock of what we are losing through inappropriate land clearing. There are other issues too, and I think we should be aware that as a result of work of conservation-minded governments, people in government with conservationist instincts, and the volunteers in the nature conservation movement, who the NCC represents, you've had the most spectacular gains for nature conservation in this state over, say, the last 50 years. Spectacular gains. So that you can talk of the national park system, the reserve system in New South Wales, as one of the 5 best in the world, standalone, warranting comparison with those of the United States and Canada and New Zealand. And that's something to be very proud of.
Just speaking of national parks, your government had a pretty solid track record. Bob Davis, your Environment Minister, and you as Premier gazetted probably more acreage of national park. I'm not sure of that statistic, perhaps you can correct me, but more than certainly most governments, if any other government. What do you make of the target that Matt Kean set for himself that has continued of 200,000 hectares a year of new national parks? They've gazetted a lot of national parks, particularly in the west of New South Wales. What do you make of all of that, and what does that mean particularly for biodiversity? You know, one of the themes of our work at the moment is the extinction crisis and the crisis in biodiversity. What is the practical impact of the national parks gazettals on solving that biodiversity crisis?
Well, it's a big question to throw at me. Now a national park user, rather than a policy specialist, but you can't imagine a full-throated approach towards species conservation, species diversity, without the contribution that the reserve system represents. And I've got to say, it's not just the scale of the national park system, it's the quality of management that lends it distinction. And in every plan of management, as I recall, there is this focus on delivering for species diversity. So I'm pretty positive about what our system represents. I haven't examined the additions made to it by the current government. I don't doubt Matt Kean's sincerity, and I think his political instincts are sensible. Just as I picked up the nature conservation agenda inspired by what Neville Wran had done before I arrived at Parliament, saving the rainforests of northern New South Wales, for example, and the vigour with which the late Paul Lander threw himself into adding to the national park system. I'd like to think that Matt Kean, as Environment Minister, saw the same combination of political usefulness and virtuous policy.
A lot of people who'd be watching this right now will be people who've been very active in NCC member organisations. I know, ranging from the large state-based organisations like the National Parks Association, Coalong, all the way down to sort of very local bush care groups and things like that. And every single one of those would be able to name some sort of grievance that they've got, some campaign that they're trying to fight right now. As someone who's been involved in Australian political life at both the state and federal level for a very long time, including as Premier, what's your advice to advocacy organisations who are trying to be heard by the political class, and particularly in the next 9 months leading up to the state election? What advice do you have for those of us who are trying to influence public policy?
I think to find champions in the Parliament and to educate people in the Parliament, to go and see, to beat a path to members of Parliament, backbenchers in opposition, looking for issues, and to brief them on the case for a particular campaign, whether it's plastics, for example, or saving a very specific part of the endangered natural environment, or a campaign for a particular species preservation, or something against a controversial industrial practice. Get champions in the Parliament. If I think back to pre-Wran government, the conservationists, people like Milo Dunphy and others, his generation, were very good at finding backbenchers who had an iota of sympathy and then educating them, taking them on bushwalks, for example, briefing them thoroughly. And Milo's handwritten representations to ministers and MPs and the beautiful calligraphy of his architect's script were worth framing. And not only did they look beautiful, but they captured the urgency of his conservationist instincts. And I speak of someone who visited him twice when he was on his deathbed and said to him that I hope he gained a lot of satisfaction at the end of his life, reflecting on the bushland his advocacy had saved. It's a very special contribution. But finding, again, I've said it twice, but finding and training and nurturing and persisting with members of Parliament who will be your advocates and maybe ministers in the next generation is a good approach to take. And simply visiting MPs with delegations. If a member of Parliament sitting in his or her local electoral office has you come in with 20 people on the roll, young and old, on the roll in their electorate, that has a huge impact. That has a huge impact. That MP, he doesn't see that many delegations, might see individuals, but to see a big delegation in his office having to send out for extra chairs, some people having to stand in the corner because there aren't enough chairs to be found, is going to be impressed by that. And if a minister's not delivering, that MP is going to be saying something like, well, don't tell me how big an issue this is. I've got them coming into my office. There are 25 of them in the last delegation, and they're all on the roll.
That reminds me of a minister whom I won't name last year, who said to me when I was meeting with him, he said, every time you bloody raise something, insert name of MP here, is on the phone to me within 2 minutes, having a go about it and wanting to know what's going on. So that sounds like
all good.
Very good advice.
That's how the process works.
Yeah.
We've just been through a federal election, and we were waiting for the results for over a week in some of those seats. Think of Gilmore on the New South Wales South Coast, for example. It was 100 to 200 votes from my recollection that determined that seat.
Yeah.
So in a marginal seat, and there can be closer results in state elections, in a marginal seat in a tough election, an MP's normal political instincts will have them sensitive to 20 to 25 voters who turn up to argue the case for a bit of bushland protection or stronger action on plastics.
Yeah. You mentioned the federal election, and obviously the talk of the town at the moment are the Teals, who've been elected to the federal parliament. What do you predict for New South Wales? Are we going to see a Teal wave in New South Wales?
I'm not sure. I think there will be a lot of collaboration between the federal Labor government and the New South Wales coalition government on energy policy. That means the focus on renewable energy zones in rural and regional New South Wales, as well as the attention to battery storage. I think that's a focus where a federal Labor government will be keen to deliver, and where a state coalition government has already said it will deliver. Both of them aware of the challenge from so-called Teal-style candidates on climate. So I think, and I wrote at the time, that the federal election sent a strong message that people wanted action on climate. And in New South Wales, I think both sides have probably absorbed that message.
Just on that, in New South Wales, I mean, just thinking about Labor now, if you're Chris Minns, if you're Penny Sharp, if you're Jihad Dib, if you're Daniel Mookie, and you want to set up some differentiating policies on climate, on nature, on any of these issues. Without, I don't expect you to give the game away, but or lecture to your comrades. But what do you think the opportunities are for the Labor team right now?
I think it's the old political pursuit of identifying public needs and identifying the sort of things that are going to shift face. People want problems solved. So the pressure on our MPs in the Labor Party is to identify problems and identify solutions. And that's true in land management as it is with everything else. But the underlying anxiety, I think, in Sydney is a resumption of rapid population growth driven by high immigration and the pressure for more apartment dwelling that brings, more apartment dwellings, more high rise, and the fact that this government seems to lack a plan to provide the big dollops of assistance to the natural world. I'm thinking of some of the intensive apartment dwelling I see around Sydney, and you look out the windows of any of those apartments, and there's not a park in sight, unless it's a tiny, what we call dog park, little more than a vacant lot. And I think we've got to take an approach to the vast areas of Sydney that are given to one recreational form alone, and that's golfing. Moore Park is a good example. I know there are plans in Moore Park to convert the bulk of that land to a world-class urban park. If you're sticking people in towers, another 60,000, Clover Moore says, in line with state government policy, you've got to make a commensurate commitment to giving them land where they can roam, they can breathe in nature, they can look at natural environments, different ecosystems, side by side, making a contribution to a cooler city and to clean water. I just think population pressure means that we cannot have so much land allocated to one recreational resource and lock out of it people who want to jog through a park, walk their dogs, have picnics with their families, engage in outdoor fitness activity.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Bob, you've been involved in conservation for a long time. You've been involved in a lot of the community battles around some of these issues for decades now. For those people who, and we've got a lot of people who'll be watching this right now who perhaps haven't been involved themselves, who are thinking about what they can do, with the climate crisis, with the biodiversity crisis, they want to be able to do something useful to progress some of these issues. What's your advice to those people?
Just bear in mind that the parks you enjoy, the great national parks in rural New South Wales, the parks around Sydney, the parks you enjoy, the clean water, the work that's taken place over decades to render our rivers a whole lot healthier, cleaning up the muck that once choked the Cooks River, for example, just to dwell on rivers a bit longer. The attention we've got to natural vegetation, reinstating original vegetation, all this has been driven by good campaigns by voluntary conservationists, and the research behind it, the advocacy, the publicity does cost money. And if people can opt to donate to our environment, they'll have the satisfaction of knowing that every dollar has been invested in a world that they want to have their kids live in.
Professor Bob Carr, former Premier, former Environment Minister and former Foreign Minister of Australia, thank you so much for joining us on our telethon.
My pleasure, Chris. Any dealings with the Nature Conservation Council? remind me of my old days as a young minister in Neville Rand's government, my first job, Minister for Planning and Environment. I called the voluntary conservationists in and effectively said to them, what do you want to have done? And they eagerly gave me their priorities. And I was honoured to be able to implement many of them.
Fantastic. Thanks so much.